Frances Leland had made up her mind about Thomas Fairchild the first moment she laid eyes on him, and in the 3 weeks since his arrival in Caldwell, Kansas, nothing had given her reason to change it. It was the autumn of 1879, and the cattle town of Caldwell sat perched on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a bead of sweat on a cowboy's brow, rough, restless, and perpetually on the verge of something violent. Frances had come west 2 years prior with her father, Gerald Leland, who had staked his life savings on a dry goods store that now occupied the best corner lot on Main Street. Gerald was a gentle man with a bookkeeper's hands and a preacher's faith in people, which meant he trusted everyone equally and foolishly, and Frances spent considerable energy compensating for that particular flaw. She was 26 years old, sharp-eyed and clear-headed, and she had learned early that in a town like Caldwell, a woman's best defense was her ability to read a man's character before he opened his mouth. Thomas Fairchild, she had decided, was the easiest read she'd ever encountered. He had ridden into town on a gray November morning with a trail crew of 8 men, driving the last cattle herd of the season north to the stockyards. He was 31, tall in the saddle, broad across the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from Kansas limestone, and a pair of dark eyes that moved constantly, cataloging everything and revealing nothing. He wore a battered leather duster the color of old blood, and he carried himself with the particular kind of authority that comes not from title or wealth, but from the simple fact that a man has never once doubted his own right to take up space. Frances had watched him from behind the counter of the dry goods store as he'd walked in that first morning, and leaned against the wooden counter with his hat still on, which was the first mark against him. "I need rope," he said. "Good rope, not the kind your daddy buys cheap and sells expensive." "My father buys quality goods and prices them fairly," Frances said. "That's so." He looked around the store with those cataloging eyes, and she could see his opinion of the place being formed just as quickly as she was forming her opinion of him. "The rope on that back shelf is the same brand I saw at a store in Wichita last spring, and they were asking 40 cents less per yard." "Then perhaps you should return to Wichita." He looked at her then directly, with the kind of unhurried attention that Frances found simultaneously impressive and infuriating. "You always this friendly to paying customers. You haven't paid for anything yet." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, because she suspected Thomas Fairchild had not yet fully committed to the concept of smiling, but a softening around the eyes. He bought 4 lengths of rope without another word about the price, set his coins on the counter with deliberate precision, and walked out without looking back. That should have been the end of it. But Caldwell was a small town, and Thomas Fairchild's crew had been hired on to help move the last of the stockyard cattle through processing before the winter shipping deadline, which meant he and his men would be in town for at least 3 weeks. Frances saw him at the livery, at the saloon's front window when she walked past, at the general store, at the church on Sunday where he sat in the back pew and looked like a man serving a sentence rather than attending a service. She gathered intelligence about him the way she gathered everything carefully, without appearing to try. The men who worked for him spoke about him with the kind of plain respect that wasn't earned through fear. "Fair man," said Amos Whitley, one of his drovers when he came in for tobacco. "Pays what he says he'll pay, says what he means. Doesn't drink on the trail and doesn't let his men drink either." Frances had filed that away without expression. She talked to Martha Hendricks, who ran the boarding house where Fairchild and 3 of his men were staying. "Quiet," Martha said. "Keeps to himself. Never a problem. Left his boots outside his door the first night, and I thought, well, that's a man who doesn't expect anyone to clean up after him, and that counts for something." But Frances had also seen him lose his temper in the street behind the stockyards, when a boy from one of the competing crews had let a gate swing wide and scattered 6 head of prime cattle across 3 blocks of Caldwell. She'd been in the alley collecting a delivery, and she'd heard Thomas Fairchild's voice cut through the noise like a blade, sharp and hard and dismissive. He had not struck the boy, but his words had been the kind that left marks, and the young drover had walked away with his head down and his ears burning. Francis had watched that and thought, there it is. There is the real man underneath the fair wages and the quiet manners. The kind of man who uses his voice the way other men use their fists, which is arguably worse because it leaves no bruise anyone can point to. She had made her judgment, and she had settled into it comfortably, the way you settle into a familiar chair. Thomas Fairchild was rough and selfish, the kind of man who built his own comfort on the edges of other people's discomfort, who used his considerable personal force the way a hammer uses a nail. She was wrong. She did not find this out all at once. It came to her the way the plains reveal themselves in early morning light slowly, in layers, each one showing her something she hadn't seen before. The first layer arrived on a Thursday, 11 days after Fairchild had come to town. Francis was walking home from delivering a box of account books to Mr. Hutchins at the telegraph office when the temperature dropped so sharply it felt like the sky had made a decision. In November on the Kansas plains, weather didn't arrive, it descended, and it descended on you personally. The wind came screaming down from the north, carrying with it the first genuine bite of winter, and Francis wrapped her wool coat tighter and walked faster. She was passing the alley beside Murdoch's hardware store when she heard a sound that stopped her thin and high, not quite a cry, more like the sound a creature makes when it has stopped expecting help. She turned and looked into the alley and saw a child sitting against the brick wall, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around itself. A boy, she thought, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing a cotton shirt so thin she could see the individual weave of it, and trousers held up by a single suspender. No coat, no hat. His feet were wrapped in pieces of burlap tied with twine. Francis moved immediately because that was her nature. She did not stand outside a problem and consider it. She walked into it. But she had taken only 3 steps when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. And then Thomas Fairchild was in the alley ahead of her, because he had been walking on the other side of the street and had crossed it faster than she could account for. She stopped. He crouched down in front of the boy with the natural ease of a man who does not consider kneeling beneath him. "Hey," he said, and his voice was completely different from any version of it she had heard before. Low, unhurried, warm in a way that seemed to come from some place genuine and unperformed. "What's your name?" The boy looked at him with large, hollow eyes. "Billy." "Billy, where's your people, Billy?" "Mama's at the hotel. She's sick." The boy's teeth were chattering so hard she could hear it from where she stood. "She told me to stay inside, but I was hungry. And then the wind came, and I couldn't find my way back, and I don't know how long I've been here." Thomas Fairchild did not ask another question. He stood, shrugged off his leather duster in one motion, the long, heavy coat that Francis had never once seen him without, and wrapped it around the boy's thin shoulders. The coat was enormous on him, pooling on the ground like a curtain, and the boy disappeared into it the way something small disappears into safety. Fairchild tucked it around him with careful hands, making sure the collar was up around his ears. "That'll do," Fairchild said. "Now, which hotel?" "The Continental." "Right." He picked the boy up, coat and all, as if he weighed nothing worth mentioning, and stood. The wind hit him full force now with his coat gone, just his worn flannel shirt between him and the November air, and Francis saw him flinch just barely, the smallest contraction of the muscles across his jaw before he started walking. Francis stood in the alley and watched him go, and she felt something shift inside her chest so suddenly that she put one hand against the brick wall to steady herself. It was not the coat, or rather, it was not only the coat. It was the way he had done it, the way there had been no calculation in the motion, no performance, no sideways glance to see who was watching. It was the way his voice had changed for the child. It was the way his hands had been so careful tucking that enormous coat around a small pair of thin shoulders. It was the fact that he was now walking down Caldwell's Main Street in the first truly bitter wind of the winter season in nothing but a flannel shirt, carrying a strange boy to a hotel, and the only expression on his face was concentration on getting the child where he needed to go. Frances Leland stood in that alley for a full minute, which was not like her at all, and reconsidered everything. She caught up to him half a block from the Continental Hotel. She fell into step beside him, and he glanced at her sideways with those dark, cataloging eyes, and she said, without preamble, "I'll find out which room his mother is in. You'll frighten the desk man less if he sees a woman first." Fairchild looked at her for another moment. "All right," he said. The mother's name was Clara Webb, and she was 23 years old and consumptive, and she had come west from Tennessee with her son and a husband who had died of fever in Missouri, leaving her with $2 and a profound determination to reach her sister in Dodge City. She had made it as far as Caldwell before the coughing had worsened, and the money had run out. She was lying in a room she had not yet paid for, because the Continental's owner, a heavy-set man named Garfield Pruitt, had the particular brand of decency that extends itself to widows and sick women up to a point, and that point was approaching rapidly. Billy went to his mother like water finds its level, immediately and completely, and Frances stood in the doorway and watched Thomas Fairchild set the boy down gently and speak to Clara Webb in the same low, careful voice he had used in the alley. He did not offer her charity in a way that would require her to feel diminished by accepting it. He said he had been through Missouri himself, and that the fever had been genuinely terrible, and that he was sorry about her husband, and he said it the way people say things that they actually mean. Then he said he would speak to Mr. Pruitt about the room and that she shouldn't worry about it, and he said it the way people say things when they intend to follow through. On the way out, he stopped at the front desk and paid for Clara Webb's room through the end of the week out of his own pocket. Frances saw him do it because she was standing close enough to see, and she saw him do it in such an offhand way that even Mr. Pruitt seemed uncertain afterward whether the transaction had actually occurred. They walked out into the cold together, Frances and Thomas Fairchild, and stood on the boardwalk in the wind, and Frances realized she had been holding her breath for approximately 4 minutes. "You'll freeze," she said, because his flannel shirt was all he had and the temperature had continued dropping. "I'll live," he said. "Come to the store," she said. "My father has wool blankets on the shelf. You can have one." He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something between amusement and caution. "I'll pay for it," he said. "I know you will," she said. "I wasn't offering it for free." And that, improbably, was the beginning of something. He came to the store that evening, not just for the blanket but seemingly because he had decided, with the same quiet deliberateness with which he made all his decisions, that Frances Leland was worth spending time in proximity to. He and her father talked for an hour about cattle prices and rail expansion and the future of Kansas, and Frances listened from behind a stack of inventory ledgers, and found herself paying close attention to the way Thomas Fairchild engaged with Gerald Leland patiently, with genuine interest, without the faint condescension she had seen some men direct at her father's gentle bookkeeper's manner. Gerald Leland, for his part, was immediately and completely won over, which surprised Frances not at all, because her father was won over by everyone. What surprised her was that in this case she was beginning to suspect he might be right. Over the following days, Thomas Fairchild began stopping by the store in the evenings, after the stock work was done. These visits had no obvious purpose, which Frances found both suspicious and interesting. He would examine things on the shelves, ask her father questions about supply and demand, drink the coffee Frances put out for customers without being asked, and occasionally address a remark directly to Frances that was sharp enough to require a sharp answer, and she would give him one, and something in his eyes would catch like a flame in a lamp. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a landscape by walking through it rather than looking at it from above. He had grown up in East Texas, the second of 4 children, on a cattle ranch that his father had built from almost nothing after the war. His father was a serious man who believed in work as a form of prayer and had raised his children accordingly. Thomas had left at 18 to drive cattle north for the first time and had never really stopped moving since, though it was not the restlessness of a man running from something but the purposefulness of a man building toward something. What he was building toward, it turned out, was land of his own. "I've been looking at a section west of town," he told her one evening, leaning against the counter while she sorted through a new shipment of fabric bolts. "Good grass, access to the creek, better ground than most of what's left in this part of the territory." "Land in this county doesn't come cheap," Francis said. "I've been saving for 12 years, he said. She looked up at him. "You'd settle here, in Caldwell." "A man has to settle somewhere," he said, and his eyes held hers for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and Francis felt the warmth in her face and returned her attention to the fabric bolts with perhaps more concentration than they strictly warranted. She was not a woman who fell easily. She had watched her mother spend 30 years making herself smaller to fit around her father's needs, not because Gerald Leland was cruel, but because that was simply the architecture of marriage as it had been explained to her mother, and her mother had believed it without question. Francis had decided very young that she would not build herself into a smaller shape for any man, and so she had held all men at a careful, analytical distance, and she had been quite comfortable there, or at least she had told herself she was comfortable, which is nearly the same thing. Thomas Fairchild was the first man who had never once seemed to want her to be smaller. He argued with her, which she had not expected. When she expressed an opinion, he engaged with it rather than nodding through it, and when he disagreed he said so plainly, without apology or softening, which she found startling and then, gradually, enormously refreshing. When she told him that the tariff on imported goods was going to strangle small merchants in cattle towns like Caldwell before the decade was out, he disagreed with the portion of her argument that concerned rail shipping costs, and they talked about it for 45 minutes while her father made himself scarce with the particular tact of a man who recognizes something in progress. It was during one of these evenings, about 2 weeks into what Francis had begun thinking of privately as their strange, undefined, unsanctioned courtship, that she made the mistake of bringing up the incident behind the stockyards. She did not mean it as a challenge, or rather, she told herself she did not mean it as a challenge, though if she was honest with herself the distinction was finer than she usually liked to admit. "I heard you spoke harshly to one of the drovers 3 weeks ago," she said. "The boy who let the gates swing. I was in the alley." He was quiet for a moment. The lamplight moved across his face and she watched him work through something internal, something that showed in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands. "I did," he said. "Was it necessary?" "It was necessary to address it," he said. "Whether I addressed it the way I should have is a different question." He looked at her steadily. "No, I was too hard on him. The cattle scattered and the season's been rough and I lost my temper more than the situation called for. I know that." Something passed through his eyes that she recognized, because she had felt it herself, the particular discomfort of an honest person confronting their own dishonesty. "I went and found him the next morning and told him so." Francis looked at him. "You apologized." "I told him I'd been harder than the situation warranted and that he'd done the right thing going back to close the gate as quick as he did." He paused. "Men in my position don't apologize often enough. I know what it feels like to have someone with authority over you use that authority like a weapon. I try not to be that." Francis was quiet for a moment. "That's a more complete answer than I expected," she said. "What did you expect? Defensiveness. What would be the point of that?" he said. She had no good answer for that, and the silence that followed was warm rather than empty, and she was aware of standing closer to him than she had been 5 minutes ago, though she could not have accounted for the specific moment at which the distance had decreased. Gerald Leland chose that particular moment to reappear with a coffee pot and 3 cups, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who is very consciously not smiling, which is a kind of smiling. The second week of December arrived with a cold snap that sealed the ground hard and brought the last of the season's activity at the stockyards to a close. Thomas Fairchild's contract work was finished. He and his crew would be free to ride south for the winter, back to Texas where the weather was merciful, and return in the spring. Frances did not think about this directly. She thought about it obliquely, the way you look at something bright by looking slightly to the side of it. On the Saturday before his scheduled departure, Fairchild came to the store in the middle of the afternoon and asked if Frances would walk with him. Her father said, without being asked, that he could manage the store perfectly well for an hour. Frances put on her good coat and her wool hat and went. They walked south along the edge of town to where the buildings gave way to open land, and the grass was pale and silver in the winter light, and the sky above the Kansas plains was the particular shade of deep blue that you only get in cold, clear air. Frances could see for what felt like 50 miles in every direction, which was one of the things she had come to love about this place despite herself. This openness that had frightened her when she first arrived and now felt like breathing room. Fairchild walked beside her with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, which she had learned was something he did when he was working toward saying something difficult. She waited. "I'm not riding south," he said finally. She looked at him. My crew will manage. Amos Whitley is a capable foreman. I've paid them through the season and seen them set for the winter." He stopped walking and turned to face her, and the wind moved through the winter grass around them with a sound like breath. "I made an offer on that section of land west of town. It was accepted 2 days ago." Frances looked at him for a long moment. The plains stretched out around them, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. "You're staying," she said. "I'm staying," he said, "but I want to be clear with you about why." He met her eyes with that direct, unhurried attention that she had initially found arrogant and had come to understand was simply the expression of a man who considered honesty worth the discomfort it sometimes caused. "I'm staying because of the land, which is good land and worth having. And I'm staying because of you, which I would like you to know plainly rather than finding out sideways." Frances felt the warmth in her chest spread outward and was briefly annoyed at herself for how completely and immediately it did so. "That is very plain," she said. "I can be plainer if you'd prefer." "I think that's sufficient plain for now," she said, and something in her voice made him smile, the full thing this time, not a softening or a suggestion but an actual smile, and it transformed his face so completely that she felt she was seeing him properly for the first time, as if the sun had come out from behind a particular cloud she hadn't known was there. She reached out and took his hand, which surprised both of them equally. "I thought you'd written me off," he said. "I had," she said. "And then I watched you give a child your coat in November cold and walk him to his mother without your coat on, and I reconsidered." He looked down at their joined hands and then back up at her, and in his eyes was something she had not seen there before, not the guardedness or the calculation or the careful management of a man who has learned to protect himself, but something open and a little undefended, and she recognized it because she felt it herself, and it was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. "I didn't know you saw that," he said. "I was behind you," she said. "I was going to help the boy and you got there first." "You would have handled it better," he said. "You would have known what to say." "You didn't say much," she said. "That was exactly right." They stood there in the winter light on the edge of Caldwell, holding hands like two people who have crossed a long distance and arrived somewhere unexpected and found it better than anything they had aimed for. And the wind moved through the grass, and the sky held its cold, clear blue, and neither of them said anything for a while because neither of them needed to. Gerald Leland was so transparently pleased when they returned that Frances spent a long moment being grateful that he had the grace not to say anything about it. He simply refilled the coffee and asked Thomas his opinion on a new flour supplier in Wichita, and Thomas answered him with appropriate seriousness, and the three of them sat in the warm back room of the store while the December wind pressed against the windows, and it felt, Frances thought, remarkably like something that was going to last. The weeks that followed were among the most interesting of Frances's life, which was a thing she would not have predicted. Thomas Fairchild was not a man who courted quietly. He came every day, not to linger and be decorative, but to be useful, which Frances found both endearing and occasionally overwhelming. He helped her father rearrange the storage room, which had been a source of frustrated complaint from both of them for 6 months, into something genuinely functional. He fixed the hinge on the front door that had been sticking since October. He brought firewood without being asked, stacking it with the precision of a man for whom doing things correctly is a matter of personal honor. But he also talked to her. Truly talked, the way people talk when they have decided the other person is worth the full weight of their attention. He told her about the land, about his plans for it, the cattle he intended to run, the structure he was going to build in the spring. He had very specific opinions about construction materials that she found she could discuss with him at length. He asked her questions about the store's supply chain that were intelligent enough to require intelligent answers, and he listened to her answers with the focused attention of a man storing information he intends to use. And he made her laugh, which was the thing she had least expected. Not broadly or easily, but at specific and well-chosen moments, with a dry, observational wit that appeared to be something he kept largely to himself, shared selectively, like a resource he was careful not to waste. She found herself watching for it, the small compression of his mouth before a dry remark, the way his eyes caught light when he was about to say something that would make her press her lips together to keep from laughing in front of customers. She found herself rearranging her workday to include the late afternoon, when he most often came by. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments. While pinning fabric samples or entering ledger figures, she would find her thoughts drifting to something he had said, or the way the lamplight had moved across his face, or the memory of his voice going quiet and careful in that alley for a shivering boy. Clara Webb and her son Billy, she should note, were no longer in Caldwell. Thomas had quietly made arrangements with the stage line and paid Billy and his mother's passage through to Dodge City, where Clara's sister had been located through the telegraph and was expectantly waiting. Billy had come to the store before he left and solemnly returned Thomas's leather duster, which had been cleaned and folded. Thomas had crouched down and told the boy he'd kept it in better condition than Thomas himself managed, and Billy had shaken his hand with great seriousness, and Frances had found something in her throat that required a moment to clear. It was on a gray December afternoon, just before Christmas, that Thomas's past came briefly and inconveniently to Caldwell in the form of a man named Leland Marsh. Marsh had been a foreman for the same outfit Thomas had worked for in his early 20s, a large operation out of Texas called the Braxton Cattle Company, owned by a man named Emmett Braxton, who had made his fortune in ways that did not bear close examination. Marsh was a compact, pale-eyed man with the look of someone who had given up on the concept of sunlight, and he arrived in Caldwell on a stage and came directly to the boarding house where, through some means Frances didn't ask about, he had learned Thomas was staying. Thomas did not tell Frances about Marsh's arrival immediately, which was the only real difficulty they had in the early weeks of their relationship, not dishonesty, exactly, but a habit of self-containment that was so deeply ingrained in him that he sometimes forgot that sharing a thing was an option. Frances discovered Marsh's presence the way she discovered most things, by paying attention. She saw Thomas speaking to an unfamiliar man in the street outside the livery, saw the tension in Thomas's shoulders that was absent in nearly every other context, and when he came to the store that evening, he was quieter than usual, and the small, careful muscle along his jaw was working. "Who was the man at the livery?" she said. He looked at her for a moment and then sat down at the table in the back room with a quality of controlled fatigue that she had not seen in him before. "Leland Marsh," he said. "He worked for a cattle company I was with for 3 years when I was younger. We parted badly." "How badly?" He was quiet for a moment. "I left because I wouldn't participate in what Emmett Braxton was doing with the books." He was stealing from his own investors and falsifying his cattle counts to the rail companies. I told him I wouldn't be part of it and left. Marsh stayed. He's been with Braxton ever since. What does he want now? Thomas looked at his hands, a gesture she had never seen from him before, and it told her this was costing him something. Braxton wants me to sign a statement that would muddy the record if his investors ever bring action against him. He's saying that I worked the books with him, that I was party to it. Which is a lie. He raised his eyes to hers. I'm telling you this because I don't want you to hear it some other way and have to wonder. Frances sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. What are you going to do? Tell Marsh to go back to Texas, he said. If Braxton wants to put his lie in front of a judge, I have 12 years of my own records and 3 men who worked alongside me when I left who know what actually happened. I don't need anything from you, he said, and then immediately heard how that had come out and leaned forward slightly, and his eyes were very direct. I don't say that to push you away. I say it because this is my problem and I'll solve it myself, and I don't want you thinking it's something that touches you. Frances considered him for a long moment. Thomas, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name in that way, with that weight, and they both noticed it. Everything that touches you touches me. Whether we've spoken it plainly or not, you understand that. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight and something changed in his face, softening and clarifying at once, the way water clears when the silt settles. Yes, he said, I know that. Then tell me what you need. He told Marsh the next morning, with Frances standing on the boardwalk 30 feet away because she had decided to be there and he had not told her not to be. The conversation was brief and not particularly gentle, but it was also not the kind of roughness that Frances had originally attributed to Thomas's character. It was the plain, cold directness of a man who has looked at an injustice and found it insufficient to deserve his capitulation. Marsh left on the afternoon stage. Thomas watched the stage until it was out of sight, and then he turned and walked to where Frances was standing, and she saw in his face something that was not quite relief, it was simpler than that. It was the expression of a man who knows he did the right thing and is not particularly surprised by this, because he intended to all along. Done, he said. Good, she said. He reached out and straightened her collar, a small, intimate gesture that he seemed to do without thinking, and then looked slightly startled at himself for having done it. Frances reached up and put her hand over his where it rested at her collar and held it there for a moment. I would very much like you to stay, she said. Not the land, you, in Caldwell, with me. He turned his hand under hers and held it properly, fingers wrapped around hers in the cold December air. That is exactly where I intend to be, he said. They were married in March of 1880 in the small clapboard church at the end of Caldwell's Main Street, on a day that began cold and ended warm, as Kansas spring days sometimes do, as if the weather itself is making a point. The ceremony was modest but genuine. Frances wore a dress her mother had sent from Ohio, pale blue wool, simply made, with ivory buttons down the back, and Gerald Leland walked her down the short aisle with an expression of such undisguised happiness that several women in the congregation produced handkerchiefs preemptively. Thomas Fairchild stood at the front of the church in a dark coat she had not seen before, new, she realized, bought specifically for this occasion. And when she walked toward him, his face underwent that particular transformation she had come to recognize and had never tired of, the one that meant she was seeing him without any of his habitual guardedness, the way you see a landscape without weather. The preacher, a young man named Aldous Crane who had arrived in Caldwell 6 months prior with more conviction than experience, read the words with appropriate gravity. Thomas said his vows in the same low, clear voice he used for everything that mattered to him. Frances said hers looking directly at him, because she had decided some weeks ago that she intended to mean every word and wanted him to see that she was meaning them. When Aldous Crane said that Thomas could kiss his bride, Thomas cupped her face in both hands with the same careful deliberateness with which he did everything with intention, without performance, and kissed her. And the small congregation applauded, and Gerald Leland pressed his handkerchief briefly to his eyes, and Francis thought, with the clarity that sometimes arrives at precisely the moments you expect sentimentality. Yes, this is correct. This is the thing that makes sense. The reception was held in the back of the dry goods store, which Gerald had decorated with impractical optimism using every ribbon and colored paper the store had in stock. Martha Hendricks brought food. Amos Whitley, who had stayed on as Thomas's first hired hand on the new land, brought whiskey and distributed it with the generous authority of a man who takes hospitality seriously. The celebration went on until the winter stars were sharp and thick above the Kansas plains, and Frances danced with her husband in the store she had grown up running, between shelves of flour and bolts of fabric and coils of good rope, and she thought she had never been so purely happy in her adult life, which was a thought she allowed herself fully and without reservation. They moved into the farmhouse on Thomas's land at the end of April. It was not a grand house, one main room, a sleeping room, a kitchen attached by a covered passage. But Thomas had built it with the same care and precision with which he did everything, and it was solid and warm and situated on a small rise that gave them a view of the creek to the west and the open grassland rolling out in every direction. And Frances stood in the doorway on the first morning and felt the spring wind on her face and thought that she had been right to come west, though the reason she had thought she was right had turned out to be entirely wrong. The first spring on the land was hard work in the best possible sense. Thomas had 20 head of cattle to start with, a modest beginning, carefully chosen, and Amos Whitley managed the ranch hands, while Thomas divided his time between the cattle operation and the business side of things, which he had a precise and unsentimental head for. Frances kept the books, and found that the work suited her in ways she hadn't anticipated, the numbers organizing themselves into a picture of something that was genuinely being built. She also continued working at the dry goods store through the mornings, because Gerald Leland needed her, and because she had always loved the work, and because Thomas had never for a single moment suggested she should stop. He had in fact said once, with the directness that still sometimes caught her off guard even now that she was entirely accustomed to him, "The store is yours as much as your father's. Don't give it up on my account." She had kissed him for that, specifically and deliberately, and he had looked briefly startled and then very pleased, which was her favorite sequence of expressions on his face. The summer brought heat and the particular kind of hard physical labor that leaves you honest. They worked beside each other and around each other, and the days were long and exhausting and good in the way that exhausting days are good when you are building something together. They argued sometimes, not bitterly, but with the full force of two people who each have strong opinions and the habit of expressing them, and they learned the particular skill of arguing well, which is a skill that matters in a long life together more than most people admit. They learned each other's silences, too. Thomas had several kinds of silence, and they meant different things. The silence of concentration, the silence of concern, the silence of contentment. Frances could distinguish them now with the ease of long familiarity, and she had learned that the silence of contentment, the one that settled over him in the evenings when the work was done, and she was reading, and he was going over accounts or sitting on the porch looking at the open land, was the most complete version of Thomas Fairchild, the one that was entirely at rest. She also introduced him, that summer, to the injustices that she had come west already aware of, but that the wild frontier made impossible to ignore. The Comanche and the Cheyenne had been pushed from this very land within the last decade, forced onto reservations by treaties that kept being broken as soon as they became inconvenient for the United States government. And Frances had opinions about this that were not fashionable among most of Caldwell's citizens. She had grown up with a father who believed in fairness as a first principle rather than a convenience, and the dispossession of the native peoples of the plains struck her as something that ought to be named plainly. Thomas listened to her without rushing her. He had seen enough of the frontier to have developed his own complicated understanding of it, and he did not pretend the history was clean. "There's no taking back what's been done," he said one evening on the porch, watching the grassland go gold in the evening light. "But a man can decide not to be part of the next wrong thing, and he can be decent in the dealings he has with every person he encounters." He paused. "That's not enough. I know it's not enough, but it's what I can do." Frances had looked at him in the evening light and thought, "This is a man who takes the full weight of hard questions without flinching." She had known she loved him for some time, but it deepened in that moment into something that felt permanent in the way the bedrock under the Kansas plains is permanent, solid, and specific, and entirely her own. She told him that night, lying in the dark with the prairie wind against the window and the cattle moving quietly in the field below, that she loved him. She had said it before during the courtship, with appropriate care. But this time she said it differently. Simply, completely, without preamble or qualification, the way you state something that is no longer a discovery, but a fact of the landscape. He was quiet for a moment, and then he pulled her closer with the careful deliberateness that was his way with everything precious, and he said it back with the same simplicity. And she knew that for Thomas Fairchild, who chose words the way a craftsman chooses tools, with care and intention and no waste, this was the most complete declaration he was capable of, and it was entirely enough. In the autumn of 1880, Frances became pregnant. She told Thomas on a Saturday morning in October, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, with the particular directness with which she delivered all important information. "I'm going to have a child," she said. "In the spring, I think, maybe April." He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and then he crossed the room in 2 steps and took her face in his hands the way he had in the church, and he held her face and looked at her with an expression of such complete and unguarded feeling that Frances, who was not prone to sentiment, felt her eyes fill. "Are you well?" he said. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I'm going to keep working." "I know you are," he said. "And I want Dr. Whitmore to attend, not the midwife who smells of vinegar." "Whatever you want," he said. "I want you to stop looking at me like that because I'm going to start crying, and I find that extremely inconvenient." He pulled her gently forward and held her, and she felt his breath against her hair and his hands solid on her back, and she cried a little anyway, which she was privately willing to admit was exactly what she'd wanted to do. Gerald Leland received the news with a happiness so profound, it seemed to reorganize his face entirely. He immediately began making plans to turn the storeroom's back corner into a dedicated area for baby supplies, which was impractical but touching, and Frances allowed it. The winter of 1880 was long and cold, and Frances worked through it at the store and at the farm's books, and at the steady, uncomplaining work of being pregnant on the Kansas plains, which was not so different from other kinds of endurance she had practiced. She was not fragile by nature, and she had no interest in performing frailty, and Thomas respected this completely. He took on more of the physical work of the farm without commenting on the adjustment, and he was present in the evenings with the particular quality of attentiveness that had characterized him from the beginning of their relationship, which she appreciated more deeply now than ever. They talked about the child in the evenings, in the way of 2 people who are thinking about the future seriously, names, arrangements, what kind of people they intended to be as parents. Frances had strong opinions about the education of children, particularly girls, and Thomas had strong opinions about work ethic and character, and they found that their opinions were more compatible than either had a right to expect. "If it's a boy," Frances said one evening, "I want him to know how to do accounts as well as how to rope a steer." "That can be arranged," Thomas said. He was going over the cattle records at the table while she sat by the lamp with the farm's account ledger. "And if it's a girl," Frances said, "I want her to know that she doesn't need to make herself smaller for anyone, and also how to do accounts and rope a steer." He looked up from his records, and his mouth did the small compression that meant something was going to be funny in a moment. "I'll make sure the steer knows it's an equal opportunity exercise," he said, and she laughed, and the lamp moved its warm circle around them, and outside the February wind pressed against the walls of the house they had built together on the open Kansas plain. Their son was born on the 14th of April, 1881, which Thomas remarked was a more punctual arrival than most cattle he'd dealt with. Dr. Whitmore attended, and Gerald Leland stood on the porch of the farmhouse for 3 hours being unable to be useful in any way, and Amos Whitley spent the same 3 hours finding unnecessary tasks to do in the barn within earshot. The boy was healthy and loud and possessed, from his first hour, of a quality of unapologetic presence that Francis recognized from somewhere extremely specific. He had Thomas's dark eyes and Francis's particular expression of comprehensive assessment, which on a newborn was both improbable and completely accurate. Thomas held his son with the same careful deliberateness with which he did everything, hands cupped around a person precious and specific, and Francis watched from the bed where she was propped against pillows and thought, "There it is, the whole thing, the reason the world makes the shape it makes." They named him Gerald Thomas Fairchild, because Francis would not accept that her father's name not be included, and Thomas had no objection. And when Francis brought the baby to show her father, he made a sound that was the farthest possible thing from the composed, gentle bookkeeper's demeanor he usually presented, and held his grandson with shaking hands and wet eyes. And Thomas stood in the doorway of the store with his arms folded, and looked at the two of them with an expression that Francis knew by now was his version of the most complete happiness he was capable of. The years that followed were the years of building, of the ranch expanding, of the store growing under Francis's increasingly confident management, of Gerald Thomas growing from a loud infant into a solemn, curious 3-year-old who had inherited his grandfather's gentleness and his father's directness, and was therefore, as Amos Whitley observed with satisfaction, going to be entirely too much for everyone to handle. In the spring of 1883, Francis gave birth to a daughter. They named her Margaret Ruth, after Thomas's mother who had died the previous winter, and she arrived into the world with even more conviction than her brother had, which took both her parents several days to fully absorb. Caldwell itself was changing. The cattle trade that had built the town was beginning to shift as rail lines extended further south and west, and the wild edge of the place, the gunfights and the gambling and the occasional violence that characterized the peak years of the trail town era, was softening into something more settled. Francis watched this with interest and some complicated feeling, because she had come to the town in its rough period and had grown to love it in that period, and the settlement of it felt like both progress and loss, which is how most true changes feel. Thomas was respected in the community by this point in a way that had nothing to do with performance. He served on the town council for a term, not because he enjoyed politics, but because there were 2 decisions being made that he thought were going to be made wrongly, and he preferred to be in the room. He was a fair employer, a precise businessman, and a man who was known to say exactly what he meant and back it up with his actions, which was remarkable enough in any community to be noted. He was also, Francis observed on an October afternoon in 1883, the most extraordinary father she had ever witnessed, though she suspected she might be biased. She was watching from the kitchen window as he stood in the yard with Gerald, who was 2.5, patiently teaching the boy to understand what cattle were doing and why, crouched down to the boy's eye level with complete seriousness, treating his son's questions as questions worthy of real answers. Baby Margaret was strapped against Thomas's chest in the carrying cloth Francis had fashioned, and she was studying the cattle with the same concentrated attention as her father, and the whole tableau struck Francis so suddenly and completely that she had to set down the cup she was holding before she dropped it. She went outside and stood in the yard, and Thomas looked up at her approach, and the smile he gave her, full, unhurried, entirely for her, was the same smile she had seen for the first time on the edge of Caldwell in the winter light in 1879, and it had not diminished or grown routine. It had, if anything, deepened into something that knew itself better. "Come look at the cattle," Gerald announced. "I see the cattle," Frances said. She was looking at Thomas. He met her eyes over the boy's head, and something passed between them that needed no words. The whole long shape of the last 4 years, the building of the thing they had built, the settled, specific reality of it. He reached out his free hand and she took it, and they stood in the October sun in the yard of the farm they had made together, with their son telling them what the cattle were doing as if they did not know, and their daughter studying the sky with her father's dark, serious eyes, and the Kansas plains rolled away from them in every direction, golden and wide, and entirely indifferent to anyone's individual story, which is one of the things Frances had come to love about them. The way the land simply went on, requiring nothing, offering everything. In the spring of 1884, Frances's father developed a difficulty with his heart. It was not serious enough to be immediately alarming, but it was serious enough that the doctor recommended he step back from the demands of the store. Gerald Leland accepted this with the gentle equanimity that characterized his acceptance of everything, and Frances took over full management of the store, which she had essentially been running for 2 years anyway. Gerald retired to the small house Thomas built for him on the east corner of the farm property, close enough to have family around him at all times, with a good view of his grandchildren from the front porch. It was a good arrangement, and Gerald thrived in it, and the children visited him every day, which was good for everyone. Gerald Thomas adored his grandfather with a devotion that Gerald Sr. accepted as his natural due, and Margaret Ruth sat with him on the porch and listened to his stories with the same focused attention she gave to everything, which made Gerald feel his stories were more worth telling than perhaps they were. Thomas made sure Gerald was comfortable and well supplied, and included in the life of the farm without ever making him feel like a responsibility. He treated Frances's father with the same straightforward, unpatronizing respect that he gave everyone he considered worth respecting, and Gerald Leland had said to Frances once, with the simplicity of a man who says things he genuinely means, "I would not have known to hope for a man like him." Frances had said, "No, neither would I." The dry goods store grew. It was no longer quite the modest enterprise her father had started with. By the mid-1880s, Frances had expanded the inventory to include materials that the growing farming community around Caldwell needed, and she had a system of suppliers and accounts that she managed with the precision and intelligence she had always possessed, but had now been given full latitude to apply. She hired 2 women to help in the store, both of them young, both smart, and she was deliberately and specifically the kind of employer who treated her employees the way she had always wanted to be treated, as capable people whose judgment was worth consulting. Thomas built the cattle operation from the original 20 head to a real working ranch over the course of 5 years, which was not spectacular growth, but was solid, considered growth. The kind that doesn't collapse when a hard year comes, because it was never built on wishful thinking. They had 2 hard years, a drought in 1882 and a brutal winter in 1886 that killed cattle across the plains, and they came through both of them without serious loss, because Thomas made conservative decisions with the same conviction he made all his decisions, not from timidity but from a clear-eyed understanding of risk. The Caldwell of 1886 was a different town from the Caldwell of 1879. The great cattle driving era was genuinely winding down, the Kisham Trail traffic a fraction of what it had been, and the town was reinventing itself with the complicated pragmatism of frontier towns that survive by changing shape. Frances watched this with her businesswoman's eye and adjusted the store accordingly, expanding the agricultural supply side of the inventory as the cattle trade contracted, and the farming homesteaders became the dominant customer base. On a January evening in 1887, sitting by the fire in the farmhouse with Thomas across from her and both children, Gerald Thomas, now 6 years old, and Margaret Ruth, 4, asleep in their beds, Frances looked up from the account ledger she was reviewing and found Thomas watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking." "You were looking like you're about to say something." He smiled. "I was thinking about the alley," he said, "by Murdoch's hardware store." She looked at him. In 1879, when you came around the corner and found the Webb boy. When I found the Webb boy and found you there already," she said. "I didn't know you were there," he said. "Not until later when you told me." "You wouldn't have done it differently if you'd known," she said. "No," he said, "but it meant something to me that you'd seen it, not because I wanted credit for it," because he paused, turning the thought over with the care he gave to things that mattered. "Because it was one of those moments that were actually real, not performed, and you saw it real, and he stopped. And I reconsidered everything," she said. "Yes," he said. She closed the account ledger and set it aside. "I had been quite sure about you," she said. "I thought I was very good at reading people." "You are very good at reading people," he said. "I was wrong about you." "You were wrong about the part of me you saw first," he said. "That's a different thing. The part you saw first," he considered it. "I was rough sometimes. I was harder with people than I needed to be. I was working on that." "You're still working on it," she said. "Yes," he said without defensiveness, with the honesty that was so entirely and specifically him. "I expect I will be for some time." Frances looked at her husband in the firelight, at the lines that the years and the weather had deepened around his eyes, at the gray that was beginning at his temples, at the hands that had built and carried and planted and built again. She thought about the boy in the alley, Billy Webb, with his burlap-wrapped feet, and the coat that had come off those shoulders in one motion with no calculation at all. "Thomas," she said. "Frances." "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the settee, and she leaned against him the way she had learned to lean in the years of their marriage, not for support, because she had never needed support in that sense, but because it was where she wanted to be, which was a different and better reason. "I would have figured it out eventually," she said. "The measure of you, I would have gotten there." "Maybe," he said, "but the boy needed a coat." She looked up at him. He was looking at the fire with that particular expression of quiet contentment that she knew was the most complete version of him. "Is that what you were thinking about?" she said. "In that alley, the boy needing a coat?" "That's all I was thinking about," he said. She felt the truth of that entirely, and it was one of the things she would love most about him for the rest of her life, that in the moments that counted, he was never thinking about anything other than the thing that needed doing. They sat together in the firelight while the Kansas winter pressed against the windows of the house he had built and she had made into a home, and outside the land stretched away in the dark, endless and patient in theirs, and inside the children slept with the deep, uncomplicated trust of children who have never had reason to doubt that the world is solid, and Frances Leland Fairchild sat beside her husband and felt the remarkable, specific weight of a life that had arranged itself into something better than she had known to want. The spring of 1888 brought their third child, another boy, born in May with the stubbornness and energy of a Kansas storm. They named him James Arthur Fairchild, and from his first week he was everything his older brother was not, which was to say he was loud and impulsive and physically fearless in a way that made Amos Whitley say the boy was going to be either the best cattleman in Kansas or the shortest lived, and Thomas said that those two things were not mutually exclusive. Gerald Thomas, 7 years old by the time James arrived, received his brother with the careful seriousness of a child who has decided to take the responsibility seriously. He appointed himself the authority on what James was and was not allowed to do, which James ignored with cheerful completeness from the moment he was mobile. Margaret Ruth, 5, took her baby brother apart with the same concentrated investigative attention she applied to everything she encountered, and having satisfied herself that he was adequately interesting, admitted him into her orbit on provisional terms. Gerald Leland Sr., now 62 and moving more slowly than he had, held his newest grandson with an expression that was the complete and wordless version of everything he had ever felt about the life he had built and the family it had produced. Thomas stood beside him on the farmhouse porch that spring afternoon and looked at his father-in-law holding his son and said nothing because nothing was required, and Gerald Leland looked up and said quietly, "You are a good man, Thomas Fairchild." And Thomas looked at him steadily and said, "I'm trying to be." And Gerald Leland nodded and looked back at the baby, and that was all that needed saying. The years of the late 1880s were the years of full life, abundant, complex, demanding, and good. The farm was a real operation now, 60 head of cattle, 4 hired hands, a reliable relationship with the rail shippers, a reputation for quality stock that reached beyond Caldwell to buyers in Wichita and beyond. The store was Frances's domain absolutely, and she ran it with an intelligence and precision that had made it the most reliable retail establishment in 3 counties, and she employed 6 people by 1889, which was a thing she was quietly proud of, and which Thomas noted specifically, and said was exactly what he expected from her, which was the most pleasing thing he could have said. The children grew, Gerald Thomas into a quiet, serious boy who loved numbers and cattle in approximately equal measure, Margaret Ruth into a girl of remarkable intellectual appetite, who read every book that came within her reach and several that didn't, and James Arthur into the force of nature that he had always threatened to be, capable and daring and possessed of a fundamental goodness underneath the tumult that made Frances think, when she watched him, of a man she had met in a dry goods store in November of 1879, who had kept his roughest edges visible until you saw the thing underneath them. She told Thomas this once, and he was quiet for a moment and then said that if James turned out to be half the man he was trying to be, he would consider that a success, and Frances said that she thought he had considerably underestimated both his own achievement and his son's prospects, and he said that she might be right, and she said she was, and he said he knew that. In the autumn of 1889, they had been married 9 years. The children were 8, 6, and 1, and the farm was prospering, and the store was thriving, and Caldwell was a genuine small city with a newspaper and a school and a doctor's office and 2 churches. Frances sat on the porch of their farmhouse on an October evening while the light went golden over the plains, and Thomas came and sat beside her, and the comfortable silence of 2 people who know each other completely settled around them. "Do you think about what it would have been like," Frances said, "if you'd ridden south that December?" Thomas looked at the light on the grass. "Sometimes," he said. "Not often. I think about the alley," she said. "I think about how close it was. How I was wrong about you for such a specific time, and then how that one afternoon changed everything." "Billy Webb," Thomas said. "Billy Webb," Frances said. "I wonder sometimes where he is. Whether his mother recovered, whether he remembers a cowboy who gave him a coat." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I wrote to Clara Webb 2 years ago," he said, "through the Dodge City postmaster." Frances turned to look at him. "You did?" She wrote back, he said. "She's well, remarried, her husband is a decent man from the sound of it. Billy is 12 now. She said he's a clever boy." He paused. "She said he does remember. She said he talks about it." Frances looked at her husband. In the autumn light his face was familiar in every line and shadow, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, not because of the features themselves, but because of what they contained, the patience, the honesty, the care, the specific and unperforming goodness that had been there in the alley when no one was watching, or rather when he had thought no one was watching. "You never told me," she said. "It felt like something private," he said. "Between me and the memory of it, maybe." He looked at her. "I'm telling you now because it doesn't feel private anymore, because nothing feels private from you anymore." She reached up and touched his face the way she had learned to touch it, with the certainty of a person who knows exactly where they are and has chosen to be there. He turned into her hand slightly, the way he always did, and the small surrender of it never stopped making her feel the full weight of what they were to each other. "I love you, Thomas Fairchild," she said. "I have loved you since that alley, though I took some time to admit it." "I know," he said. "That's not an invitation to be smug about it." "I'm not smug," he said. "I'm grateful." The light was going now, the plains turning to shadow, the first stars appearing above the enormous Kansas sky. Inside the house, Gerald Thomas was reading to his sister while James Arthur was, from the sound of it, conducting some experiment involving his supper that was not going to end well. Gerald Leland Sr. was in his house on the east corner with his lamp lit, and the warm square of his window was visible from the porch, which Francis checked for every evening the way you check for a thing you would not want to lose. "We've built something," Francis said. "We have," Thomas said. "Not just the farm. Not just the store. No," he said, "all of it." She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch of their house on the Kansas plains in the October dark, while the stars multiplied above them, and the land went quiet in the way it goes quiet at the end of good days. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of sufficiency, of a world that has provided what it needs to and is resting. Inside, James Arthur's experiment ended with the sound she had anticipated, followed by Gerald Thomas's patient voice and Margaret Ruth's laughter. Thomas did not get up immediately. He waited, his arm around his wife, to see if the situation would resolve itself. And it did, because they had raised children who could resolve most things themselves, which was a thing both of them considered a point of quiet pride. In the years that followed, the Fairchild farm became a fixture of the Caldwell landscape. The children grew into themselves with the particular confidence of people who had been loved completely and consistently, and had never been required to be smaller than they were. Gerald Thomas joined his father in the cattle business at 17, with a precision and seriousness that made Thomas look at his son, sometimes, with the bemused recognition of a person seeing their own character clearly from the outside for the first time. Margaret Ruth went east to school at 20, to a women's college in Ohio that Francis had researched and selected with the same thoroughness she applied to everything, and came back 2 years later with her head full of ideas and her eyes full of purpose, and Francis watched her daughter come back and thought, "I did this right, at least." James Arthur became, as promised, a remarkable cattleman, bold and physical and capable of risk in ways that made his more cautious older brother look sometimes pained, but fundamentally solid in character in ways that mattered more than any of the surface tumult. He was 20 when he first rode north on a cattle drive, following in his father's footsteps by a different route, and Thomas watched him go with the expression Francis knew was the one he wore when he had made peace with something that cost him something. Thomas Fairchild in his 50s was the same man he had been at 31, with 40 years of weather on his face and a quality of earned stillness that had always been there but had fully settled, the way a structure settles when it has been tested by the elements and found to be sound. He was quieter in a different way now, not the guardedness of a man protecting himself, but the quietness of a man who has learned that the things most worth saying are few, and the moments that demand nothing are precious. He still gave things away without calculation. Francis still noticed because she had always noticed. A good horse to a young man setting up on a section of adjacent land who could not quite afford a horse of that quality, and could not know that Thomas had chosen the horse specifically for the work he knew the young man's land would require. A season's worth of store credit quietly arranged for a widow 2 miles out, who had been making very careful choices about which necessities she could afford. A summer's work at fair wages offered to the son of a man who had been in difficult circumstances, offered matter-of-factly, without charity in the transaction, which was the way Thomas always arranged it because he understood that dignity is not separate from material need, but runs alongside it and must be equally attended to. Francis ran the store for 30 years and then handed it to the woman she had hired at 20, who had turned out to be everything Francis had suspected she was when she hired her, and who ran it thereafter with the same intelligence and precision. The handover was accomplished with a formality that Frances had insisted on: written agreements, fair terms, a genuine transaction, because she believed in doing things properly to the end. On the 40th anniversary of their marriage, March of 1920, a year of such extraordinary change that the Wild West they had both known seemed like something from another world, which it was, Frances and Thomas sat on the porch of the farmhouse that he had built in 1880, and they had expanded twice since then, and looked at the land that the light was moving across in the particular way. It moved across the Kansas plains at that latitude and that season. A way that was entirely specific and that Frances had never once stopped finding beautiful. They were old. This was a fact they both acknowledged without drama. Thomas was 71 and carried the years in his body, the way a man carries a full pack, aware of it, adjusted to it, not interested in complaining about it. Frances was 66 and had the precise, clear mind she had always had in a body that was slower and more demanding than it used to be, which she found irritating, and which she addressed with the same pragmatic stubbornness with which she had always addressed obstacles. Their children were grown and scattered and rooted and returning, the way children become when they have been properly launched. Gerald Thomas ran the farm. Margaret Ruth was a teacher in a school she had helped establish, unmarried by choice and wholly satisfied with that choice, which Frances had known would be the case from the time her daughter was 12 years old. James Arthur was somewhere in Wyoming with a wife and 4 children, and a cattle operation that sounded, from his letters, like a very manageable kind of chaos. Gerald Leland Sr. had died in 1895, peacefully, in his small house on the east corner of the property, with Frances's hand in his and Thomas sitting in the chair by the window. He had been 80 years old and entirely himself to the last, gentle, interested, and without complaint. Thomas had said, at the grave, the most honest and plainest eulogy Frances had ever heard. He was a good man who trusted people more than they deserved and was right about it more often than made sense. She had been unable to speak at all, which was not like her, but Thomas had spoken for both of them, and that had been enough. On the porch in the March sun of 1920, Thomas reached over and took her hand, and Frances looked down at their joined hands. The same gesture she had made first, 41 years ago, in the winter light on the edge of a cattle town, after watching a man give a shivering child his coat. His hands were rough now in a way they had not been then, worked and weathered, mapped with the history of everything he had built and planted and repaired and returned to again. Her own hands were not unchanged. 40 years, she said. 40 years, he said. And you still haven't taken proper care of that door hinge, she said. The one on the kitchen side. He looked at her. The hinge is fine. It sticks, she said. It has always stuck, he said. That is its nature. Its nature is to be fixed, she said. He squeezed her hand, and she felt the smile in the gesture even before she saw it on his face. The old smile, unchanged, the one that transformed him, the one she had seen for the first time on the edge of the plains in the winter of 1879, the one that had never once grown ordinary. "I'll see to the hinge tomorrow," he said. "You said that last week," she said. "I'll see to it tomorrow," he said again, with exactly the same inflection, and she laughed, the full, real laugh she had discovered she was capable of with him, and with almost no one else, the one that came from somewhere entirely unguarded. The Kansas plains extended themselves outward in every direction, as they had always done. The sky above them was the same sky it had always been, that particular western blue, impossibly deep, with no end to it. The grass moved in the March wind the same way it had moved in the November wind of 1879, and the creek caught the light the same way it had always caught the light, and the land remembered nothing of the specific people who had walked on it, and loved each other and built things and argued and laughed and been wrong about each other and reconsidered and been changed by the reconsidering. But Frances and Thomas Fairchild remembered. They held the whole long shape of it between them, in the way of people who have made something real together over real time, not the grand version that a story tells itself afterward, but the true version, the one made of ordinary mornings and difficult seasons and small deliberate kindnesses, and the accumulated weight of choosing, again and again, to see each other clearly and stay. It had started with a coat, with a child who needed warmth and a man who did not calculate the giving of it. With a woman standing in an alley who had been so certain she was right and found, in one unhurried motion, that she was beautifully, profoundly wrong. All the years since had been the working out of that reconsidering, the long, specific, irreplaceable reward of having changed her mind. Frances leaned against her husband's shoulder on the porch in the spring light, and felt his arm come around her with the ease of 40 years, and listened to the wind in the grass and the sound of the farm settling into itself around them, and thought that the Wild West she had come to in her 20s had been nothing like what she'd expected and everything she had needed, and that the rough, selfish man she had written off at first glance had turned out to be the most generous and specific and singular person she had ever known, and that this was the shape of a life well made, not without difficulty or error, but true and lasting, and entirely, completely, irreversibly hers. The hinge Thomas fixed on a Thursday, it no longer stuck. Frances noted this without comment, which was its own form of acknowledgement, and he knew that she had noted it, and that was enough. That was, as it had always been between them, entirely enough.